This video deals with symbolizing the concept not. Not and all of its synonyms. Any formula that has a tilde as its main connective, like say tilde p, is called a negation. So we now have conjunctions, which use ampersands, conditionals, which use arrows, and negations, which use tildes as their main connectives. Well, let's jump in and symbolize some sentences. It's false that she's not unsympathetic. Well, if you look at this sentence, we can see that we have three synonyms for not. The underlying simple sentence is she is sympathetic. By convention, our capital letters stand for positive sentences, so here is she is sympathetic, and then what we can do is just add the three tildes out in front. We don't need to separate them with parentheses or anything. This just says it's false that she's not unsympathetic. Now, it turns out that two tildes basically reverse their value in the same way that minus signs reverse their own value. So it would also be acceptable to symbolize this as just tilde s. That's an equal sign there. Tilde 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 s equals tilde s. The basic principle is that you can add or subtract two tildes at any time. So what else would be correct? Well, if you just are fond of tildes, you could write 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 tilde s. 5 tildes, 3 tildes, 1 tilde, it's all the same thing. Alright, you get the basic idea. Sentence number 2. It's not true that you'll be killed if you lie. Well, let's symbolize you'll be killed if you lie. That's obviously L arrow K, because what follows if is the antecedent. What's it's true that negating? It's true that is one of our synonyms for not, and what it does is negate an entire sentence. So there's basically parentheses going right here. What's not true that? This whole sentence. And so in order to negate this sentence, we have to put in parentheses and a tilde just like that. In fact, it's not true that will typically negate an entire sentence. Now it's important to contrast number 2 with number 1. It's false that works just like it's not true that. Well, how come I didn't put parentheses up here? Well, it is negating the whole sentence, but the whole sentence itself was just another sentence with some negations in it. So it would be a mistake to add more parentheses around tilde tilde s. In fact, if you wrote this, let me put it off to the side, tilde 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 s, and you put in parentheses like that, that's what I consider obnoxious parentheses. They are doing no work at all, and they're just creating confusion. So this would be a mistake. But here, we do need the parentheses. Sentence number 3 also starts with it's not the case that. In fact, sentences 1, 2, and 3, their main purpose is to make a point about these phrases. And so when you go to symbolize this sentence, let's see what we've got. That it's not the case that Janet will make Jell-O only if it's Christmas. However, Janet never makes Jell-O if it's not a special occasion. However is actually the main connective for the whole thing. That's where the break is. And so it's not the case that won't negate everything. How do you symbolize Jell-O only if it's Christmas? Well, remember, the rule for only if says what follows only if is the consequent. So this is actually going to be J arrow C. Now that will need to go in parentheses, and the it's not the case that is actually negating that expression. On the other side of the ampersand, we have Janet never makes Jell-O if it's not a special occasion. This is actually just going to be what's following if? Not a special occasion. So that's tilde s. If it's not a special occasion, then she never makes Jell-O. Notice the word Jell-O here isn't recapitalized. It was capitalized in its first sentence. Here's Janet makes Jello. Here's Janet never makes Jello. And so that's tilde J as opposed to just J by itself. And now we're done with the symbolization. But of course, what am I leaving out that's really important? One more set of parentheses like this. Okay. Moral of these three sentences. It's false that, it's not true that, it's not the case that. All three of these expressions are ways of negating entire sentences. Oftentimes, they're going to be a tilde outside parentheses, but not always, because if it's just a string of tildes, you don't want to include parentheses. Okay, I hope I didn't make that more complicated than it really needs to be. These next two sentences deal with the concepts unless and also without. And both of these concepts mean if not. In fact, the important principle to remember is that unless equals if not. If every time you see unless and also without, which is its synonym, then you just replace it with if not, the symbolization becomes pretty easy. So this says one should avoid eating animals unless they're dead. Well, that just means one should avoid eating animals if they're not dead. So cross off unless, write in if not, and then notice if I was to rewrite the important stuff, what I would now say is A, if not D. This is all I really need to care about, and now we just follow the rule for if. What follows if is the antecedent. What's following if? Not D. And so the correct symbolization is if not D, then A. I should make a point. So this is the correct symbolization. We are done with the sentence, unless equals if not. I should also make a point that the word avoid, this is obviously a word that has strong negative connotations, but we're not going to worry about symbolizing negative connotations. When you all get jobs doing symbolization in the real world, as I always joke, then you'd have to make a difficult decision here. Do you need to symbolize avoid as involving negation? It really depends on the context and how it relates to other sentences. But if we started worrying about negative connotations in these sentences, it would get really messy, and so it's best if we just avoid negative connotations. Now, most students can't afford college tuition without financial aid. Well, again, let's cross off without and write in if not. Now the sentence is, notice we have another negation right here. In fact, one thing that you should probably do is always go through and look for the negations. It's so easy to miss one, and that creates a problem, obviously. But if I rewrote the important stuff, I would say not A, if not F. So that's what I care about. What follows if is not F, therefore the symbolization ought to be if you don't have financial aid, then you can't afford college tuition. And that's how it works. So these are not difficult words. Another note about this last sentence. If you think about it, you can think of it in terms of a necessary condition. Most students can't afford college tuition without financial aid also means that financial aid is necessary to afford college. Or so maybe I should write is necessary for affording college. F is necessary for A. Well, how do you symbolize F is necessary for A? What is necessary is the consequent, so that would be A arrow F. And it turns out that these two formulas are equivalent to each other. this equivalence makes good sense if you think in terms of necessary condition. So imagine that this says F is necessary for A. Well, then if you don't have F, you don't have A. F is necessary for A. So if not F, then not A. There's a general principle here, and that principle is that any formula of the form P arrow Q, you can reverse the sides and write Q arrow P as long as you negate both sides, or make the sides opposite. If you started with tilde D arrow A, what's that going to be equivalent to? Well, A doesn't have a tilde on it, so we're going to write tilde A on one side. Now tilde D obviously does have a tilde, so we just drop it off and we'd get tilde A arrow D. So these two formulas would also be equivalent to each other. A is necessary for not D. Therefore, if you have not A, if you don't have A, then you're going to get D. Harder to hear that equivalence, but this is the underlying concept. This relation is actually called contraposition, and it's a proof rule in many systems, though it's not an especially useful proof rule, so we won't add it to our system. All the sentences on this page are instances of what I refer to as complex negations. Complex negations are sentences that have multiple simple sentences, and the trick is to decide how many you have to negate. Well, we know the basic idea here is to distinguish two patterns: tilde P ampersand tilde Q versus tilde P ampersand Q in parentheses. The tilde cannot be distributed across the ampersand. If this was a minus sign, you might expect that if you had minus P and Q, that would be the same thing as minus P and minus Q. But negation is not subtraction, and the tilde has a more complicated relationship with the ampersand than that. These two formulas are not equivalent. They mean very different things. That's the bottom line. This first one means negate both parts. Negate the P and negate the Q. What does this one mean? This says negate at least one part. So literally what we're doing is negating the set, or negating the pair. But the way to do that is to say that at least one of them is false. This is saying it's false that both P and Q are true. Therefore, at least one of them has to be false. When we're doing the sentences below, there's a two-step process I recommend. Step one is identify the simple sentences. So I'm just going to write here, identify simples. You find the simple things and list the simple sentences are the underlying positive sentences. Step two is the hard part. Decide how many to negate. Decide how many to negate, and what makes this hard is that you have to do it using intuitions. That is, you can't look for simple tricks like, oh, the sentence has the word both in it, so that means I'm going to negate both. It doesn't work that easily. Okay, so let's do these together. Number 6, he distrusts both leprechauns and politicians. Okay, what are the simple sentences here? He trusts leprechauns and he trusts politicians. Okay, now imagine that somebody says this sentence to you in conversation. He distrusts both leprechauns and politicians. Does he trust leprechauns? No, he doesn't. Does he trust politicians? No, he doesn't. So we are negating both parts, and tilde L and tilde P is definitely the way to do it. Let's contrast this with sentence number 7. Sentence number 7 says, The president does not want both an employee and his immediate supervisor to attend. Well, first of all, let's get the simple sentences. Notice you can, of course, immediately see that it's going to be E and S, but I think it's best if you really stop and you ask yourself, what do E and S stand for? E stands for the president wants an employee to attend. S stands for the president wants his immediate supervisor to attend. Now, you ask yourself how many of these need to be negated using intuitions. So the best thing to do is, imagine that you're working at this place and it's your job to send people off. Well, if somebody says this sentence to you, what are they saying? The president does not want both an employee and his immediate supervisor to attend. Is he telling you don't send either person? No, he's saying don't send both of them together. So that's why we have to negate just at least one of them. Now, I'm confident that if you heard this sentence in conversation, you would know exactly what it means and you would act appropriately. But when people symbolize, somehow they forget about their intuitions. And I think what happens over and over again is people see the word both and they say, oh, that's got to mean negate both. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. This pattern over here really says that not both of them are true. At least one is false because not both of them are true. This one means both of them are false. So the word both can be thought of as a part of both of these formulas. Both is a helper word with and. And so I actually want to say that the word both doesn't change the meaning of any sentence. It helps clarify it oftentimes. All right, sentence number 8. Although the philosophers will visit Manhattan, they haven't time to see the Statue of Liberty and the Empire State Building. So what's the main connective for this sentence? I hope that you're recognizing that it is although, and although, of course, is working with this comma to place an ampersand as the main connective. And it says that they're going to Manhattan. All right, the philosophers are going to Manhattan, as they do every 4 or 5 years for the American Philosophical Association. However, they haven't time to see both the Statue of Liberty and the Empire State Building. Well, what are the simple sentences? So we have complex negation on the back side, right? So they have time to see the Statue of Liberty, and they have time to see the Empire State Building. How many of these need to be negated? It's just at least one of them. It doesn't say that they don't have time to see either of them. It doesn't say that they're not going to do any sightseeing. It says that they don't have time to see both of them, basically. They don't have time to see both the Statue of Liberty and the Empire State Building. I like sentences like number 8. It's something like this, which is likely to show up on a test, because this sentence sort of creates a meaning. It creates a story that helps your intuitions when you're thinking about what to negate. Finally, sentence number 9. Neither the cashier was there, nor the waiter, nor Monsieur Fasquelle. Here's a complex negation with 3 parts. This is probably the easiest sentence on the page, though. Simple sentences: the cashier was there, the waiter was there, and also Fasquelle, or you could use either the M or the F for this. I'll use the F. So the cashier was there, the waiter was there, Fasquelle was there. How many of these have to be negated? Well, in fact, neither nor is always going to negate all the parts. So we're going to say tilde C and tilde W and tilde F. I should have left myself more space for the tildes. And now we're done. We don't need parentheses on this because this is actually just a string of ampersands connecting negated formulas. You could put in the parentheses around tilde C and tilde W or around tilde W and tilde F, but they're just optional. All right, and we're done with that one. We should pause and ask ourselves, what would it mean if you said tilde C and W and F? Well, this would mean that at least one of these guys wasn't there. what would be the most natural way to say this in English? One natural way to say it would be to take the tilde in front and state it as it's false that. In fact, a tilde outside parentheses always makes sense as it's false that. So you could say it's false that the cashier and the waiter and Fasquelle were all there. Another way is to switch this to the equivalent or expression. Now, don't think about this if it's going to confuse you, but it turns out that these two formulas are equivalent to each other. The wedge means or, and we won't see it officially until the third test, but what this sentence is saying is either the cashier wasn't there, or the waiter wasn't there, or Fasquelle wasn't there. And they're equivalent to each other. Oftentimes you would say this in English as opposed to that. In fact, if we go up here, we can point out that tilde P ampersand Q is equivalent to tilde P or tilde Q. Either the P is false or the Q is false. And as we'll eventually talk about, the or also means that it's possible that they're both false. But that's a subject for another day. I guess for the sake of completeness, let me point out that tilde P wedge Q is equivalent to tilde P and tilde Q. Because this says it's false that either P or Q is true. It's false that I like pie or quiche. What does that mean? I don't like pie and I don't like quiche. All right, complex negations. They're tricky, or they can be tricky. I see a lot of mistakes with them, but I think if you stick with the strategy here, identify the simples and decide how many to negate using intuitions, you should be in good shape. The three sentences below are three of the trickier sentences that we see all semester. They're complex negations, but they're complex negations in the antecedent of a conditional. The sentences in the last screen, the last four sentences, were complex negations of a standard form, but these are especially tricky. Let's jump in and talk about them. You cannot log into your account if you don't know the username and the password. So if I rewrite this, all I'm going to say is, oops, I left off the not. Don't forget the nots. Not A, if not U and P. So, can't log into your account if you don't know the username and the password. Alright, that doesn't look like it should be difficult. What's following if? Not U and P. Do we want to symbolize that as tilde U ampersand P arrow tilde A, or do we want to symbolize it as tilde U and tilde P arrow tilde A? That U is kind of tiny there. Which do we want? For some reason, when we have complex negations after if, we have especially bad intuitions. Now, for standard complex negations, my claim is that you should identify the simple sentences and see how many you have to negate. However, when they're after if, I've actually suggested a way to try to make this even simpler. We know the difference between these two patterns, tilde P and tilde Q versus tilde P and Q. This means negate both parts. Negate both. This means negate at least one. But for some reason, when we have complex negations after if, our intuitions are so bad, I have suggested that we watch for some basic patterns in this sense. If you see if, not, and the word both here is optional, if not both P and Q, then you should immediately recognize that that's a tilde outside parentheses, And so you would write tilde P and Q, arrow. What language would you associate with tilde P and tilde Q, arrow? Well, that would be if not P and not Q. Or alternatively, if you saw if neither P nor Q. What I am doing is saying if you have a complex negation after if, let's just look for some very basic patterns. And notice this is not complicated at all, because what I'm really doing is saying if you see a single word not after if, then that's going to give you a single tilde. If you see two nots after if, then that will give you two tildes. I am oversimplifying things in some ways. Are there exceptions to these patterns in English? Yes, there definitely are. However, my hope is that we can train our intuitions to understand these things if we watch for some very specific patterns. Okay, well now back to this sentence. Not A, if not U and P. Which of these patterns up here does this sentence correspond to? Well, I hope it's obvious that it's this first one. If not P and Q. The word both is optional. If not U and P. Therefore, the correct symbolization is the first one right here. If not U and P, then not A. And this one would be wrong. Now, we can also think of this in terms of the meaning. And ideally, that's the goal, is to get to the point where we actually understand it. There's two things. There's the username and there's the password. You can't log into your account if you don't know the username and the password. Well, how many of these things do you need to log in? You need to have them both. So if I take away even one of them, then you can't log into your account. If you don't have your username, but you do have your password, well, that's not enough to get you into your account. You have to have both of them to log in. So if there's even one that you don't have, then you can't log into your account. Now you might say to me, well, but wait a second. What if I don't have my username and I don't have my password? Well, it's true. If you don't have either one of them, then you also can't log in. But that's not what the sentence says. It says if you lack even one, then you can't log into your account. This expression is a stronger expression than this one. This sentence would say, if you don't have the username and you don't have the password, then you can't log into your account. In some ways, it kind of implies that if you had one or the other, well, you might be able to log in. All right, same strategy when we get to 11. Unless they have been shucked and frozen, mussels should be purchased live. All right, so what does this say? Well, first of all, what is it that we want to do with unless? If we rewrite the sentence, we know that what it says is unless S and F, comma, L. The trick for unless is to turn it into if not. So if not S and F, L. Complex negation after if. When we turn unless into if, we see it's a complex negation after if. So, go up to the top. Which of these two patterns is correct? Do you want tilde S ampersand F arrow L? Or do you want tilde S and tilde F in parentheses arrow L? Let's all vote. I hope you've got your hand up. So wait, now I guess I have to say. So, all in favor of the first? Here's where you're supposed to have your hand up. All in favor of the second? No, put your hand down. This one is not correct. This one is correct. Because what's the language? If not S and F. If not P and Q, remember the word both is optional. I like to say that the word both never changes the meaning of anything. This one is hard to understand, but notice. There's being shucked and there's being frozen. Unless they've been shucked and frozen, you should buy them live. So if even one of these things is false, then you should buy them live. That's the meaning of the sentence. We have mentioned that you can switch the sides of a sentence if you change the values. In this case, it might help a little bit to notice that we could put the L first if we negate it, and then on the other side we could put the S and F. And so what does this sentence say? If they're not live, then they ought to be shucked and frozen. If they're not live, then only buy them if they're shucked and frozen. I don't know if it's useful to see that or not, but these two sentences would be equivalent to each other. And notice you could also read this as a necessary condition here. Being shucked and frozen are necessary for buying them not live. All right, on to sentence number 12. Actually, this is probably the easiest sentence on the page. In fact, I know it is. People don't make nearly as many mistakes with this one. If I rewrite it, it says, if you don't understand. So if not you, if you don't understand the material intuitively, and you don't want to fail, not W, comma, then you should memorize the rules. So if not you and not W, then M. Well, here we have the two nots in front of the U and the W, so I hope that in this case it's really just obvious that we want tilde U and tilde W, arrow M. Yeah. When you've got the extra knots there to make it obvious what's going on, then people are much less likely to make mistakes. Okay, so let's be clear about what's going on. Complex negations, after the word if, we have really bad intuitions. So instead of identifying the simple sentences and using your intuitions, I'm encouraging you to watch out for these patterns and follow the rules, basically, that we're associating with the patterns. Good luck. These two sentences involve one of the most common mistakes that I see on the second test. They're really not very difficult sentences, but it's almost, in my mind, like a careless mistake. Let's take a look at what they say. Having feathers is a sufficient condition for being a bird, but having scales is not a sufficient condition for being a reptile. Well, obviously the main connective is an ampersand for the but. Now, having feathers is a sufficient condition for being a bird. Well, that's easy, right? What is sufficient is the antecedent. Having feathers is sufficient for being a bird, so this is just F arrow B on the front side. Left a little more space there than I needed, but F arrow B, and on the back side we've got scales is not a sufficient condition for being a reptile. Well, how do we symbolize scales are sufficient for being a reptile? That would just be S arrow R. Now, what is the word not negating? Notice it's in front of the sufficient condition itself. And so what it's negating is the entire relationship. And so it turns out the only way to symbolize this correctly is to put the tilde outside the parentheses. Scales are not sufficient for being a reptile is the same thing as saying it's false that scales are sufficient for being a reptile. So a not in front of sufficient nor necessary is like saying it's false that for the entire sentence. Here's the rule. Not immediately in front of sufficient or necessary is always going to give you a tilde outside parentheses in this way. Okay? So F arrow B and not S arrow R is the correct symbolization of that sentence. Number 14, it's false that distrusting children is not unnecessary for being a good parent. We would never say such a horrible sentence in English, but we can symbolize it. Let's identify the negations. It's false that, oops, I didn't do a very good job there. It's false that, distrusting, not, unnecessary. We have 4 negations. Let's begin by symbolizing the positive underlying relationship. And the positive relationship is that trusting children is necessary for being a good parent. Well, what is necessary is the consequent. Trusting children is necessary, so trusting children is necessary for being a good parent. That would be P arrow C. Now let's go back and put all the tildes where they belong. It's false that. It's false that is always a way of negating an entire sentence. And yes, that one needs to be outside parentheses. Distrusting children. Well, that's obviously negating trusting children, and so that's a tilde on the C. But then not unnecessary? Those are both immediately in front of necessary. Not immediately in front of necessary or sufficient is going to give you a tilde outside parentheses, so both of these are going to have to be out in the front, and we can just stack them up. Tilde, tilde, tilde. These 3 tildes look like they're having a party here. They're very wavy. Tilde, 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 P arrow tilde C. You might read this as, it's false that, it's false that, it's false that. Distrusting children is necessary for being a parent. That was lousy. If this is correct, we could also just symbolize it as tilde P arrow tilde C, because you can always add or drop pairs of tildes. So either one with 3 tildes or with 1 tilde out in front would be correct. Notice, when we saw not unnecessary, you can tell that these things are going to cancel each other out. So one way to look at this would be to just cancel those out in the beginning. All right, main point of these 2 sentences. Not in front of necessary or sufficient is a way of negating the entire sentence. This last sentence is a tricky sentence which puts together some of the more complicated things we've talked about so far. So let's start by rewriting it. If I do that, I know that supposing that means if, so it says if neither Bart nor Homer had eaten the cupcakes, comma, then Marge would not be unhappy. So Marge not comma, unless Lisa and Ned were arguing about religion. All right, so if neither B nor H, then M not unless L and N. Lot of stuff. Where do we jump in? I think the first thing to do is to take unless and turn it into if not. Unless equals if not. Then also, Marge would not be unhappy. This not those 2 negations are going to cancel each other out, and so I think we should just cross them off and ignore them. Not being unhappy, for our purposes, just means that Marge would be happy. Okay, so if neither B nor H, then M, if not L and N. Do we see any obvious groupings, places where we would put in parentheses? Well, notice neither B nor H is clearly a chunk. And if not L and N, that's also clearly a chunk. Now, I'm not going to put in parentheses because I don't want to kind of give away what's going on here. But if neither B nor H, then M, if not L and N. We can see that there's 1 chunk here, a second chunk there, and a third chunk here. And then notice we've got 2 ifs. So what is really going on in this case is we are distinguishing P arrow Q arrow R, where we put P arrow Q in the parentheses, versus P arrow Q arrow R. This is the complex conditionals situation that we talked about in the for the first test. When we're in this situation, we know that what we want to do first of all is identify the R part of the sentence. What is R? Well, notice that neither B nor H has an if in front of it. Not L and N has an if in front of it. So M must be the final part of the sentence. All right, I will write that. Now the other two parts have got to go in front of that. Well, what about neither B nor H? This is actually a complex negation after if. Of course, this is the kind that we almost never make mistakes with because pretty obviously neither B nor H is negating both parts. So tilde B and tilde H, arrow. So complex negation after if, but this is an easy one. Not B and not H, arrow. The next one is if not L and N. This is the sort of complex negation that people do make mistakes on. But if we remember the pattern from just a couple of screens back, not L and N, that's a single tilde, and so since it's after if, we can just allow ourselves to simply say that's got to be not L and N, and then it's arrow M. So here is the correct symbolization, but now we have to decide where to put the parentheses. If we put the parentheses around the front like this, that, to check it, we want to use our intuitions and read the first arrow as causes. This would say, if, we put an if out in front, and then we're going to read this arrow as causes. If neither Bart nor Homer having eaten the cupcakes causes Lisa and Ned not to have been arguing about religion, then Marge would be happy. It seems implausible to put a causal relationship between the actions of Bart and Homer and those of Lisa and Ned. So let's try it, and let's rewrite it here, and let's try it with the parentheses on the back side. Tilde B and tilde H, arrow, and now we go tilde L ampersand N, arrow M, and parentheses like that. Of course, if we're going to read this, it's much better if we read it in the way that has an ampersand in the front. We know that P arrow Q arrow R is equivalent to P and Q arrow R. These two formulas mean the same thing. Can we write this way? Yes. We say tilde B and tilde H. That's the P part. We turn that first arrow into an ampersand, and then we bring down the Q part, tilde L and N. Then all of that goes in parentheses, arrow M. So it reads as if neither Bart nor Homer had eaten the cupcakes, and Lisa and Ned were not arguing about religion, then Marge would be happy. Yes, yes, this sounds great, and so either of these last two symbolizations is 100% correct. There are other things that are correct as well. We know that if you have P and Q, you could write Q and P, arrow R. So that means it would be okay to switch out the tilde B and tilde H and the tilde L and N. The tilde L and N can go first. But that also means that it's okay to put the tilde L and N first, even if you do it with the two arrows. Well, I know this is not an easy sentence. This is pulling together a couple of the trickiest things that we've talked about all semester, but I hope this sentence is still making sense. Good luck with the symbolization.